Hello again. I have only the faintest memory of one of my great grandparents. It was my mother's grandmother. As a boy in England, we were taken to visit her, but really the only things that stand out in my memory are the image of a front room that was furnished in a rather Victorian style. And being a young boy, I guess the other thing that stands out is the memory of either lunch or afternoon tea with lots of sandwiches and lots of cakes. But that's about all that I can remember. On the other hand, I have very clear memories of both sets of grandparents. Indeed, I had close relationships with them, and that continued right up into my adult years. From my own experience and from what I've heard others say, there's no doubt that a positive relationship with grandparents can have a big influence on your childhood and can go with you well on into your adult years. Once a month during this year, I've been talking about family relationships from a biblical point of view. And as I come to this, the last month of 2020, I want to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about the role of grandparents and what grandparents can do for their grandchildren. In Proverbs 17 and verse 6, there is this statement: grandchildren are the crown of the aged. Grandchildren are the crown of the aged. What does that mean? Well, Cattell's Theological Dictionary says that grandchildren are thus indicated to be a mark of honour, just like a crown is a mark of honour. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia says that in this context, grandchildren are pictured as a reward. In the Old Testament, it is sometimes said that to live into old age is a blessing. And this is described in terms of living to see your children's children. In other words, living to see your grandchildren. So if you like, grandchildren are the icing on the cake. There's the blessing there not only of living a long life, but also having children, grandchildren in those later years. And I know that for Lavinia and I, it has been a wonderful thing to have grandchildren, and particularly to have grandchildren who love you and want to spend time with you and talk to you. But just as grandchildren can be a blessing, so too, if we are Christians, it provides us with an opportunity to talk to them about the gospel and about salvation, and indeed to support their parents in doing so. Just over a week ago, I conducted a funeral, and I've conducted many funerals down through the years. And I'm often left with a very empty feeling at the end of a funeral. How do you adequately give tribute and sum up the life of somebody in just, say, 40 minutes, an hour, or however long the funeral lasts? And I never feel that you can really do justice to a person's life. However, memories of a person live on in the lives of those who have known them and have loved them. And so it is that memories, happy memories, positive memories of grandparents can live on in the lives of their grandchildren, live on for years to come. I want us to look at some biblical cases here, and we'll be looking at a negative case to begin with, but then some positives as well. And we'll start off by going to the Old Testament book of 1 Kings, chapter 16 and verse 25. 1 Kings 16 and verse 25. Around 931 BC, following the death of King Solomon, the nation of Israel split into two kingdoms. 10 tribes in the north formed a kingdom which retained the name of Israel. In the south, 2 tribes formed the kingdom of Judah. And the first king of the divided kingdom of Israel was Jeroboam the first, and he immediately led Israel into idolatry and away from God. The 6th king of that northern kingdom of Israel was Omri, and Omri is described in 1 Kings 16 and verse 25. Omri did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did more evil than all who were before him. So he was the worst king thus far. And he in turn established an evil dynasty. The son of Omri, who became the next king, was Ahab. And you read about his reign in 1 Kings 16 and verse 29. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, the son of Omri, began to reign over Israel. And Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. And Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him. So he was even worse than his father. And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. And Ahab made an Asherah. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. Why? Because he devoted himself even more so to the worship of false gods, to the worship of idols. The next 2 kings of the northern kingdom of Israel were sons of Ahab, and they were Ahaziah and also Jehoram, and both of these were evil. So the complete dynasty of Omri was evil. In the south, in the kingdom of Judah, another Jehoram became the 5th king of Judah. He reigned somewhere around 848 to 841 BC. And he married into the family of Omri in Israel. He married the daughter of Israel's king Ahab. Her name was Athaliah. And the nature of Judah's Jehoram is described over in 2 Kings chapter 8 and verse 18. We read there, "And he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, as the house of Ahab had done, for the daughter of Ahab was his wife, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord." So he went along with the family that he had married into, the dynasty that he had married into. After Jehoram, Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram and Athaliah, was next to reign in Judah. And the nature of his reign and the influence working upon him is described in 2 Chronicles chapter 22 and the first 5 verses. So 2 Chronicles 22, and I'll begin in verse 1. "And the inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah, his youngest son, king in his place. For the band of men that came with the Arabians to the camp had killed all the older sons. So Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, reigned. Ahaziah was 22 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri. He also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother was his counselor in doing wickedly." And his mother, of course, was the daughter of Ahab. Verse 4, "He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, as the house of Ahab had done. For after the death of his father, they were his counselors to his undoing. He even followed their counsel and went with Jehoram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, to make war against Hazael, and so it goes on here. But what you see here regarding Ahaziah, the king of Judah, is that his mother, granddaughter of Israel's King Omri, was evil. His grandfather, son of Israel's King Omri, was evil. And his great-grandfather, who was Omri himself, was also evil. So Ahaziah's father and mother, as well as his grandfather and his great-grandfather on his mother's side, were all evil. And their evil influence outweighed what could have been the positive influence of Ahaziah's grandfather on his father's side, Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat in Judah had been a godly king, although it was he that opened up the way to a link between the royal family of Judah and the royal family of Israel, and that was a mistake. So Judah's king Ahaziah had 3 generations of evil influence working upon him. We sometimes talk about something like institutionalized welfare dependency that goes on from generation to generation. Well, here you've got institutionalized evil flowing on from generation to generation. And what we see in the case here of Ahaziah is what we see in other parts of the Bible as well, that ungodly wives or husbands can have a negative influence. Ungodly fathers and mothers can have a negative influence, and even ungodly grandparents and perhaps ungodly great-grandparents can also have a negative influence, because you see in the case of King Omri of Israel that his evil influence flowed on from generation down to generation. However, there are positive examples in regard to grandparents. Let's start by going to the first book of the Bible, Genesis, and we'll go to the last chapter of that book. So Genesis chapter 50. And here we read of Joseph. You might remember Joseph, who had the coat of many colours. He was the son of Jacob. We read of him in Genesis chapter 50, verse 22 and 23. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years, and Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the 3rd generation. So Joseph lived to see not only his children, the grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren. And you think of Joseph's life. As I've said before, he was a bit of a problem child to start off with. In the Australian parlance, he dobbed on his brothers. He also was perhaps rather boastful, but God moulded him. God overcame the rough aspects of his character. He shaped him, and Joseph experienced God's providence. He was sold into slavery. He was then thrown into prison as a result of false accusations, but God looked after him through that. He was then ascended in Egypt's leadership, and he saw God at work in 7 good years, followed by 7 years of severe famine, and that resulted in his whole family, the fledgling nation of Israel, coming into Egypt and being looked after there. And so you imagine from all of that experience what Joseph, who is shown to be a godly man, what influence he would have had upon his grandchildren. You can go a little bit further to the book of Ruth, which follows the book of Judges, and Ruth was the daughter-in-law of Naomi, and both of these women had gone through very hard times. Naomi had lost her husband and her two sons. Ruth had lost her husband, and they'd gone back to Bethlehem, and they'd been forced to rely, shall we say, on charity to survive. But nevertheless, Naomi showed herself to have a lot of wisdom, and she guided her daughter-in-law, who was a very caring person, and as a result of that, Ruth eventually, through God's guidance, found a second husband, and things worked out well for both her and her mother-in-law, Naomi. And I'll read from Ruth chapter 4 here in verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went to her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore her son. And then the women said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, A son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So Ruth's son Obed was the grandfather of the great King David. But back there in verse 17, he is referred to as a son who'd been born to Naomi. He was like a son to her. And from the nature of these two women, you see that in combination with their experience of God's help would have made Naomi a very effective grandmother in what she would have had to share in regard to God and God's involvement in her life. Another example from the Old Testament is in the book of Job, just before the book of Psalms. And in a moment I'll read here from Job chapter 42 and verse 16, right at the end of that book. But many of us know what happened with Job. He was a very godly man. He was married, and he and his wife went through great tragedy, great grief, great loss. They lost their children. They lost many of their herds. Job himself was struck with boils over his whole body. And what's more, the friends who came to encourage him did virtually the opposite. They had a totally misguided concept of God. And Job was begging for God to explain, and he was showing he trusted in God, he believed in God, and yet he wasn't allowing God to be in control, if you like. And so God pointed this out to him with a barrage of questions which showed Job that God was far more powerful and far more knowledgeable about things than Job was. And in the end, things worked out for Job and his wife, and life became much better for them. And you read in Job chapter 42 and verse 16, And after this Job lived 140 years and saw his sons and his sons' sons 4 generations. And Job died an old man and full of days. And as we read right at the book, he was indeed a very righteous man. And so you are given the impression here that he and his wife would have been very effective grandparents in what they would have had to share with their grandchildren from their own experiences. I'll take one more example, that's from the New Testament, and now we'll go over to 2 Timothy chapter 1, and in a moment that we'll read there from verse 5. We're introduced to Timothy back in Acts chapter 16 during Paul's second missionary journey. Timothy has become a Christian, his mother has become a Christian, his mother is Jewish. On the other hand, his father is a Greek. So religiously speaking, it was the mother who was more the influence on young Timothy's life. But it wasn't the mother only. 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5, I am reminded of your sincere faith, and this is Paul speaking to Timothy, I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I am sure dwells in you as well. So it had flowed down through 3 generations. We go over to 2 Timothy chapter 2, and here let me read from verse 14. Again, this is Paul talking to Timothy. But as for you, continue in what you have learned and have firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it, and how from childhood you have been acquainted with the sacred writings which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. So Timothy had been taught the scriptures from childhood. And if you look at the end of verse 14, Paul calls Timothy to recall from whom he had learned about the scriptures. And whom there, as I've mentioned previously, translates a Greek pronoun which is plural. So in other words, there was more than one person who had had an influence upon Timothy's upbringing. And the indication from chapter 1 is that his grandmother would have been an influence. So, various examples, some bad, some good, in the Bible. Those of us who are grandparents recognize that there are great blessings, there are great joys in being a grandparent, but it's not all straightforward and simple. For instance, our circumstances as grandparents are changing as time goes on. The circumstances of our children, our grandchildren's parents, are changing as time goes on, and the circumstances, the outlook, the interests of our grandchildren are changing as time goes on. So there's a need here for flexibility, because our grandchildren start off as babies, they move on into childhood, they move on into the teenage years, and they move on into adulthood. And so the way that they are going to be relating to their grandparents is going to be changing as they may move through these stages. So again, we as grandparents have to be flexible. We cannot rule the lives of our grandchildren. We cannot keep things the same. And there's a whole lot of practical suggestions which can be made in regard to being grandparents. I haven't got time to cover all that in this lesson. I did come across a website which had some good practical suggestions. The site was called raisingchildren.net.au, and raising children is lowercase and it runs together. And within there is an article entitled Grandparents, Roles and Boundaries. Grandparents, roles and boundaries. And that has some good practical advice on aspects of being grandparents. But as Christian grandparents, we should be particularly concerned about the spiritual development and the salvation of our grandchildren, and indeed of our children. Because from this perspective, one of the best things that we can do to help in the spiritual development of our grandchildren is to work hard when we have opportunity for the spiritual development of our children as they grow up, because they will grow up to be the parents of our grandchildren. We have to understand as grandparents that the first authority over our grandchildren is their parents. And we should certainly not try to usurp or undermine the role of the parents in the lives of our grandchildren. When we are with our grandchildren, we certainly shouldn't be criticizing or ridiculing our grandchildren's parents, but turn that around as well. parents should not be handing over their parental role to the grandparents. Let the grandparents fulfill their role and help out where they can. Also, let the parents fulfill their role as much as they can. Another point here to keep in mind is don't play favourites. Don't single out one child and make them the favourite, or don't make the children of one of your children the favourites above the children of others of your children. I didn't find out until relatively recently that was a problem when I was young. I have a lot of memories of my mother's parents, my grandparents on her side, and I spent a lot of time with them. And apparently my parents had to speak to my grandparents and say, hey, there's other children as well, and you need to spend time with them. So this can be a problem that we fall into, favoritism, and we've got to beware of that. I like Lavinia's goal, if you like, as a grandmother, and I know that this is the goal that many other grandparents have, including myself as well. She wants the relationship with our grandchildren to be a happy, welcoming, and loving one, so that the grandchildren will always feel free to come to us, to be with us, and if needs be, to talk to us about any problems. Now, that doesn't mean we spoil them rotten. There are still guidelines, there's still things they can do and things not to do, but nevertheless, we want to create a close relationship where the door is always open to our grandchildren. As far as being a Christian influence goes, there's several points I could raise. Number one, without being overbearing, let your grandchildren see that in your conversation and your activities, Christianity is a natural and important part of your life. Let them see you live Christianity. Number two, be willing to talk to your grandchildren at their level when they raise questions about things like God and Christ and the Bible and heaven and so forth. It's one of the things I love about young children, both when our children were young and our grandchildren. There's a wonderful curiosity with the world, and they want to know about all sorts of things, and they will even raise questions about religious matters, about God and so forth. And this provides us with what Dale Hartman, a preacher, used to call opportune moments, where they've got an interest in something, they're asking questions, and we've got an opportunity to respond. Don't be too busy to respond. Also, a third point, show that you're happy being a Christian. Because if we as grandparents are grumpy and irritable and critical, then that's not giving our grandchildren a very positive view of us or of the Christianity that we follow. A fourth point, make time to be with your children, your grandchildren, make time to play with them when they're young, and to talk with them as they grow up through the years. Be interested in the things that they're interested in and the things that they're going through. Build a relationship. And a fifth point that I mention here is to spend one-on-one time with your grandchildren, letting each one of them know that you care for them. When I was a boy living in England, I had one set of grandparents out here in Australia, but with my father's parents in England, we would take three of us children, the older children, would take it in turns to go and spend a Friday night and a Saturday with our grandparents. The grandparents would come, pick us up Friday afternoon after school, take us back to their place, and we'd stay there, and then they'd bring us back on the Saturday evening. And young children call this having a sleepover, but that's one way of being able to spend time with each one of the children, because they love having that one-on-one contact. Now, I'm aware that there's all sorts of things which don't go right with having grandchildren. There are problems that arise, and things sometimes get very difficult. In these times of mobility, for instance, it may well be that you're not living anywhere close to your grandchildren. When I was born, and for the early years of my life, both sets of grandparents were living in England. Then my mother's parents moved to Australia, so for about 5 years we were in England and they were out here in Australia. Then my parents decided for us to move to Australia, so we did so, leaving the other set of grandparents back in England. So you can be separated, and we have a daughter and her family who live in Canberra, so we're some distance from them. But one of the great things about modern technology is that we've got Zoom, we've got Facebook, we've got telephones, we've got all sorts of ways that we can keep in touch, even face to face, on things like Zoom and so forth. Another issue, of course, that arises here is that grandparents are likely to still be working when their grandchildren are young, and so there's the challenge there of being able to make time to spend with grandchildren. So there's all sorts of matters that come along, and we can't cover all of that in a single lesson. But what I can say from my own experience, and what I have said already, is that a loving, caring relationship with grandparents can have a lasting effect in the lives of their grandchildren. And that is even more so if we as Christian grandparents take what opportunities there are to lead our grandchildren, to point our children towards God and Christ and Christianity and the Bible. Let's pray. Father, families can create hardship, families can be a blessing. And with sin in this world, it works both ways, that some children grow up with a very tough experience of childhood, others have a much more positive experience. And similarly, there are children who hardly have a relationship with grandparents, whereas others have a very close relationship and a caring relationship. And Father, that is an issue that in the world we have to deal with. It's one more issue, the issue of family breakdown, family problems. But you provide guidelines that help those problems to be overcome if we're willing to believe you and trust you and follow what you have to say in your word, and learn indeed from our own mistakes and experience. But Father, where we've enjoyed positive family experiences, we do thank you. Help us, in the case of us being parents and grandparents, to do what we can to be positive influences upon the families around us, and particularly help us to be positive examples and teachers, pointing our families towards you and towards the eternal life that you provide. For all those who have helped us, Lord, down through the years, for your care, your blessings, we thank you through Jesus. Amen. Thank you for taking time once more to be with me today. With the holiday season drawing closer, I hope that you'll take care on the roads, and you'll take care of children and grandchildren as the holidays start. And hopefully, God willing, we can be together again next week as we continue to look at God and Christ and what they have to share with us in the Bible. Until then, take care, look after yourselves, and see you again in a week's time. Bye bye.